Metabolically healthy people will be able to switch between substrates when they need to. So that's the term metabolically flexible.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Latt Mansor, such a treat to be with you. Welcome to the Commune podcast.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your podcast. I've had the opportunity to listen to it quite a bit over the last couple months, and you do a phenomenal job, so well done.
Thank you so much. I actually just revived the HVMN podcast since last October, so I wouldn't say I'm like a veteran like yourself. Like, I'm still learning so much, and in fact, thanks to your event at Commune, that I got to meet some of my guests that have been on, like Dr. Terry Walsh. I met at your event. I was on Max Lugavier's podcast that was also from your event. I am yet to schedule a podcast with Casey, but I think it's now with Laurel, their science officer, science director. So thank you, and now I get the opportunity to be on your podcast and learn from you as well. So pleasure's all mine.
So I'm excited to get into all things metabolism with you, and this is obviously such a relevant topic, given that some 90% of Americans are metabolically dysfunctional. So perhaps just to lay some foundational groundwork for the audience, I think it would be helpful to have a good working definition and understanding of metabolism. So could you provide a good definition of metabolism to start?
So metabolism, all 8 billion of us, we do metabolism at all times, right? So we need metabolism to survive. We need metabolism to function. We need metabolism to do everything. And metabolism is broken down into anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is building and storage, and catabolism is breaking down and utilizing what we have in our storage. And we are constantly in a state of flux between 1 and 2, between both of them. And we switch one up and we switch the other one down depending on what state we are in. If we are fed, we want to be in anabolism, an anabolic state, so that we store the food that we eat. If we are fasting or if we're working out, we want to be in catabolism because we are breaking down the materials that we've stored and we've eaten to produce energy and improve performance. So that's metabolism in general, right? It's being able to use the building blocks or substrates that we consume in order to produce energy, and we need energy to survive. Metabolically healthy and metabolically unhealthy, those terms, the way I see it, is essentially how well you utilize different substrates at the time that it needs to be used optimally. So, for example, if you're doing very high intensive exercise, glucose is more beneficial because it creates energy almost independent of oxygen in the first part of glucose metabolism, called glycolysis. So it's oxygen independent ATP generation. So ATP is the energy currency in the cell. When you go on endurance race or long distance races, you want to be able to metabolize your fats because your fat contains way more energy, and we store up to 20 to 40,000 calories worth of energy in the form of fat in our bodies versus around 2,000 in glucose. So if we are going to work out for a long time, we want to be able to tap into that storage. So metabolically healthy people will be able to switch between substrates when they need to. So that's the term metabolically flexible. Or metabolic flexibility, that's where it comes in. You're flexible in terms of switching between substrates. So I hope that clear things up.
That's a fantastic definition. I've heard metabolically flexible used in the context of a metaphor that you become like a Prius, right? So you can kind of shift between the use of electricity or petrol for fuel. And there's an analogy there with the human body that you become very adept at switching between essentially the using glucose or using fat. Now, those are the primary foundational substrates for fuel, fat and glucose, is one of them more, I guess, calorie dense or energy dense than the other?
That would be fat. So fat contains 9 calories per gram versus glucose is 4 calories per gram. Same with protein, that is 4 calories per gram. So obviously I didn't talk about protein because we don't want to break down protein, because proteins are essentially very, very valuable to us, as it makes up not just, when people think about protein, they think about muscles, not just muscles, that are made out of protein. But if you really learn the biochemistry on cell biology and physiology, all the different enzymes, hormones, and everything are essentially made out of proteins. Right, so there are proteins, amino acids, there are different sequences and different structures being bound together to create this wonderful biochemistry of life. And we don't want to break down that. So we want to be able to, that's why we want to be able to be very flexible in order to tap into our fats or glucose, because those substrates were primarily made to be either stored or broken down for energy. And then there is now ketones, which is 6 calories per gram, 6 to 7. So that's the another form of energy, if you would, that we have never in human history been able to consume directly. We have to make our own ketones. So we can go into that in a bit. If I'll let you lead the conversation on what you want the audience to understand first.
Yeah, well, this is when two podcast hosts come head to head. Who leads, right?
I mean, it's your podcast. I always enjoy. Actually, you know what? I do enjoy being on both sides. Like sometimes I enjoy just asking the questions. Sometimes I'm like, I'm just gonna sit at the back seat and let them explore my brain. And sometimes it's surprising. I find myself being surprised by myself because these people are able to draw answers that I never knew would come out from me.
Yes, yeah. I love the way that you describe the sensitive balance between anabolic processes and catabolic processes, and essentially, healthy systems work in this kind of tenuous homeostasis, right? So we need both. And then you pointed to proteins. So, we often think of proteins or the building blocks of proteins, amino acids, going to muscular creation. But as you pointed out, there's hundreds of thousands of proteins in the body, transport molecules, enzymes, et cetera, including hormones. So I want to shift just the conversation for a second to talk about these 2 peptide hormones that are sort of the yang yin of metabolism, and that is insulin and glucagon. Glucagon doesn't get nearly as much PR as insulin, but could you talk a little bit about the role of those countervailing hormones within the process of metabolism, and then potentially touch on insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance, because this seems to be at the upstream from a lot of these dysfunctional metabolic syndromes, I suppose.
Sure. So insulin is, as you said, glucagon doesn't get a lot of PR around this. So let's start with insulin, which most people have heard of. And insulin essentially gets secreted by the pancreatic beta cells, when we have high blood sugar. What it does is essentially send signals to the different cells to upregulate glucose transporters. And these transporters will then translocate up into the cell membrane so that it can start pulling in the glucose from the blood and use it either for storage or for metabolism or breaking down and develop energy. So insulin, if you think about it, it's more of an anabolic hormone. And then glucagon, it's more of the opposite. And what happens in insulin resistance is essentially the responsiveness and sensitivity of those cells being able to translocate those receptors up into the membrane is being dysfunctional. So you're sending signal, hey, it's like, think about you telling you're moving house, right? You're telling the movers to pack things up and put it in the truck and let's move on. Usually, they'll just do that. But this time, the truck drivers you're like yelling at them. It's like, hey, I have full of stuff in my house. Let's pack it up and let's put it in the truck. And they just won't listen. They just won't do it. So you end up with a cluster of stuff that you've packed and and it has nowhere to go. So essentially like that. So you have high blood sugar in your blood, and you keep telling yourself, hey, bring it in so that you can lower your blood glucose and you can use it for storage. And the cells are like, no, I'm full. I can't take in anymore. Or I'm dysfunctional. I can't take in anymore. So you're on your own. So that's where insulin resistance becomes dangerous, because a constant elevation of blood glucose, that's where all the complication comes in. Because that exposure to high blood glucose increases damage to your nerve cells, nervous system, increases damage to your kidney, increases damage to a lot of places, increases inflammation that could essentially lead to chronic diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And now they're trying to figure out the mechanism of action, how that leads to Alzheimer's, as they call type 3 diabetes. So then comes the question, what causes insulin resistance? This is, always the forever debate. And I've had amazing guests on the HVMN podcast that I interviewed. Dr. Ben Bickman is one of them.
Yeah.
Expert.
In fact, I just want to interrupt you there. I just listened to that episode, and I vehemently encourage everyone to go and look up that episode on your podcast, because that conversation between you and Ben, I know a little bit about this topic already, but I had about 25 light bulbs go off, and I hope we can cover some of that, as we get into it. But sorry to interrupt you. Please go on.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for the shout out as well. And it was so gratifying to sit with Ben, and me being a scientist who did my PhD in also diabetes and cardiovascular disease, to talk about his research and what is the current literature around insulin resistance. And I didn't even know before that, that he did his research also in Singapore in a specific demographic group, which is very relevant to me, being my genetic makeup coming from Malaysia. Half of, my mom is Chinese, my dad's Malay. So that is very relevant because my mom's side of the family has a really high prevalence of diabetes. So we got into such deep conversation. So when it comes to insulin resistance, there is a lot of theories and a lot of evidence as well that points towards it's the glucose, it's the high consumption of glucose. But then I also interviewed these two authors of Mastering Diabetes book, and they believe it's the fats. And they use high glucose, low fat diet to combat diabetes. And they have seen some good results. So ultimately, I think what it is the combination of all. There's no point to demonize one particular substrate versus the other. It's a combination of your lifestyle versus what you eat as a whole picture. If you have high processed sugar in excess, as well as in presence of high seed oil, which drives inflammation, and you add on top of that high fat content, which makes your calories intake go above and beyond, then that is the recipe for disaster, and that could be the cause of insulin resistance rather than one substrate causing it.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, clearly we've seen a massive and arguably detrimental increase in the consumption of carbohydrates, so sugar, refined grains, ultra-processed foods, etc. But it does seem to be that caustic combination of high glucose in your blood that's triggering high insulin, so anabolic, in conjunction with excess calories, that there's something there that's causing some major problems. And in that conversation with Ben, I thought it was interesting because, as you become more insulin resistant, the sugar, the glucose in your bloodstream's got to go somewhere, right? So it gets stored as glycogen. Some of it gets glycated, becomes these advanced glycation end products and glycoproteins, et cetera. But then, a lot of it is stored as triglycerides and fat cells. And, you and Ben talk at great length about how as fat cells get bigger through hypertrophy, it's all the adipokines and inflammatory cytokines that are secreted from those fat cells that then can exacerbate insulin resistance. Can you unpack that a tiny bit?
Yeah, that's like exactly what you just said, right? So a lot of people, they try to observe where there is high prevalence of heart attacks, high prevalence of diabetes, and then they look at their blood biomarkers, and then they see either high sugar or high fat or high adipokines, and then they straight away point towards that substrate. And that's a problem, because just because these different substrates were present in these high prevalence disease cases doesn't mean that they cause it, right? So another example I'll give you, Bay Area, famous for stabbings, right? There's a lot of stabbings around here. Every time there is a stabbing, you see a ambulance there. Now, would you start thinking the ambulance caused the stabbing? Because every time there is stabbing, there is an ambulance, right? So, but we automatically know that they are there to help and not the one that caused it. So it's the same thing, right? So if there is a clot in your blood, that people think cholesterol is bad, there's high cholesterol. But think about it, is the cholesterol there to cause it, or is that cholesterol trying to patch the insult to the blood vessel damage that has been done? So a lot of people argue that now, and as we advance in technology and being able to detect what these different molecules are doing, that's where we can find out what is the cause and what is the correlation and what is the mechanism that is coming in to try and fix it. So as Ben said, Ben was explaining with his research that some people tend to put on fat via hypertrophy and some people tend to put on fat via hyperplasia. So hypertrophy is the enlargement of the cell itself, and hyperplasia is division of the cells, and you just create more fat cells. And what he says is that in hypertrophy, these cells are getting bigger and bigger and start leaking these adipokines and increasing inflammation. And mind you, all of this tracks back to what we were talking earlier about the excess of calories and the presence of high sugar and high fat and processed sugar and also other stuff that may disrupt your inflammatory system like seed oils and disrupt your microbiome and all of that. And that leads to the cells getting packed with high energy, right? High storage of fats. Not only it starts leaking out adipokines, but if you think about it, what is reactive oxygen species? Reactive oxygen species is essentially, so when we talk about free radicals, that's part of reactive oxygen species. It is a byproduct of respiration. In your mitochondria, when we create energy, a mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So if you think about the cell creating energy, the mitochondria is part of the cell that creates all the energy for you. And that's where it metabolizes all these substrates for you. Glucose, fatty acid, all the same. It has that power, right? Whenever they metabolize a substrate, they will produce some reactive oxygen species. Nonetheless, it will produce it. Then people are like, well, we don't want that. We don't want, oxidative damage. We don't want free radicals to damage our cells. But some form of free radical is actually needed for the mitochondria to adapt. It's called mitohomeosis, and adapt and create antioxidant, because we create our own antioxidants such as melatonin and glutathione. But what happens in dysfunctional individuals is that this ROS production is in excess, right? You're producing too much. And if you, let's say, just hypothetically, if you metabolize 1 gram of fat, you produce like, I don't know, just an arbitrary number, like 0.0, say 1% of that is ROS. You produce that amount. If you metabolize more fats, then you produce more ROS. So think about these hypertrophic cells that has huge amount of fats. You are increasing metabolism, right? You can tell that these people have very high metabolism, but they're like, well, why aren't they skinny? Because they are trying to keep up with the input, but at the same time, they are trying to metabolize it. Their body will always prioritize survivability, which means they are going to turn up the metabolism of these fat cells. And when you turn up metabolism of these fat storage, you're also turning up ROS production. And when you turn up ROS production, you are sending signals to the cells either for cell death or sending signal to stop taking in substrates, i.e. insulin resistance, or increase inflammatory biomarkers, which is a signal to say to your body that, hey, this is a red flag, we need help here, and your immune system go haywire.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think they also become hypoxic, right?
Yeah. So hypoxic, low oxygen environment.
Right. So that can have its own downstream impacts. It's so interesting because obviously when we talk about, shedding adipose tissue, we've seen a couple of different pathways to that work. I mean, there's a plant-based diet, which is inherently low caloric. So we've seen that function. And then obviously there's the ketogenic diet, which is very, very low carb, so very, very low insulin. And obviously we've seen that work also. So it does suggest that it's a combination of these things. So we talked a little bit about insulin and its relationship to growth and its relationship to growth hormone, et cetera. And insulin, of course, is a response, the pancreas's response to the consumption of carbohydrates and refined sugars and starches, et cetera, as we discussed. Talk a little bit then about glucagon. So, and what are the processes in the body that glucagon triggers? Because in many ways, it's very much the opposite of insulin. In low glucose states, your pancreas is going to produce glucagon. So talk a little bit about that.
So remember when I talked about earlier on anabolism and catabolism? So one of the mechanism that triggers anabolism is insulin, right? Insulin draws in the substrates and then you store it. So the opposite is catabolism, so glucagon. So glucagon senses that you are fasting for a long time, your blood sugar is low. But if you think about it, even people who are fasting and people who are on ketogenic diet, they don't eat any carbs. And when you're fasting, you don't eat anything. But if you measure your blood glucose, you will still have a baseline blood glucose. Now, why is that? It's because glucagon and the other enzymes in your body is creating sugar from your storage, either from your glycogen storage or from gluconeogenesis from other substrates, right? From, fats or proteins or glutamate and all of that. So that is the role of the counterbalance. Like you said, it's a beautiful, homeostasis, equilibrium that our body is constantly striving for. And most of the time when we change certain things, we need to give the body time and also make the body recognize that is the new homeostasis or homeostatic form. And yeah, that's where it balances each other out.
Yeah. So in a low glucose state, your body can obviously release some glucose as stored glycogen. You mentioned gluconeogenesis, or the creation of new glucose in the liver. But there's also this process called lipolysis, I believe. And then can you talk a little bit about what that process looks like and how that creates available fuel for the body?
Sure. So lipolysis. So lipo, it associates with lipids, so fats. Lysis, I believe, is breaking down. So it's essentially mobilizing your fatty acids. Fatty acids are, it can be circulated in your blood, but mostly our biggest fat storage in our body is adipose tissue. And that's the fat layer underneath your skin mainly, and also around your organs. When your body needs energy, lipolysis first needs to occur on these sites, because these are already stored in triglycerides form. So it needs to be broken down in glycerol and fatty acid. So fatty acid can be transported into your bloodstream and then get taken up by different organs such as your heart, your muscles, and all of that to then create energy. So for example, a lot of people don't know that at rest, like you and me just talking right now, our hearts get 70 to 75% of its energy from fatty acids at rest. So unless we put ourselves in an hypoxic environment where it's low oxygen, or we are exercising very intensively, our heart will remain to prefer fats. And then as the requirement changes, as the environment changes and the circumstances changes, our heart will then switch over to glucose when it needs to. And that's the metabolic flexibility part that I was talking about. And that was my research in my PhD, looking at how a diabetic heart switches or unable or able to switch between fats and glucose when I put them in hypoxic environment.
Interesting. So through this process of lipolysis, you're breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol. How do those free fatty acids then become ketones, or what is the relationship there?
So what happens is that these fatty acids, they are still very long chain molecules. So they are very big molecules. So as human beings, we evolved to a point, actually not just as humans, a lot of organisms actually evolved to be able to break down fats and create ketones in your liver. And that's called ketogenesis. So why do we even need ketones, and what are ketones, right? First of all, I'll tell you the why first. As I said, the fatty acid molecules are huge. Therefore, it cannot bypass the blood-brain barrier. And when your brain, our brain uses 25% of our daily calorie energy, even though it's only 2% of the weight of our body weight.
It's very greedy.
It's very greedy. It's very energy intensive. So when it's low on sugar, it's at risk of being damaged, because if you think about a factory, you're producing goods but you're not giving any input. The machinery is still running. You are using all the electricity, you're using the manpower, you're giving it money, but nothing's going in, nothing's coming out. So that creates an environment where you are susceptible to oxidative damage and all of that. So when you're low on sugar, either when you're fasting or on ketogenic diet, the brain needs to use some other substrates, and it cannot use fatty acids because it cannot bypass the blood-brain barrier. In fact, on site, some studies show that the brain itself can create a small amount of ketones from the fat stores in the brain to produce energy. But the whole point of creating ketones has 4 carbons, whereas normal, fatty acids, they probably have much longer, like 16, 18, 20 carbons. And that ketone molecule is small enough to bypass the blood-brain barrier and arrive at the brain site as a site of respiration and create energy. And the 3 main ketone bodies that our body produces are acetoacetate, acetone, and beta-hydroxybutyrate. They're all interchangeable. So acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate, they are always in equilibrium. And then from acetoacetate can produce acetone, which gets released in your breath. Beta-hydroxybutyrate is the main ketone body that is being circulated around the body because it is much more stable. And it is also the form of ketone body that is metabolized for energy. So
Got it.
Whenever you hear beta-hydroxybutyrate or BHB, that is a ketone body that we produce or we can use. And in fact, the brain and the heart does prefer ketones whenever they're available.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. So I think this gives people really great basic understanding around how certain protocols like the ketogenic diet and fasting, then can lead to the endogenous in your own body creation of ketones as a source of fuel. So, you mentioned there that ketones are the preferred energy source of the brain. Yes, they can cross the blood-brain barrier. That's good news. But why are they the preferred source of energy there?
So in 1995, a paper published, I believe it was in Heart, and showing how ketones are more efficient per oxygen used in respiration compared to glucose. So just showing that it is a more efficient fuel. And one might ask, like, then why doesn't our body like create ketones all the time? It's because of the high sugar consumption that we are having these days that you upregulate insulin. So insulin is one of the key hormones that shuts down ketogenesis, because insulin essentially is present when we are in abundance of energy storage, abundance of substrates, so that it's telling your body to start storing in blood glucose because you've eaten a lot, and therefore you're not in a state where you can create ketones from fats. So that's why we are not having, a lot of people these days do not have ketones in their system. Whereas in the past, we often have, fed and famine, harvest seasons and famine seasons, and people are fasting most of the time. Or people go, even if we go all the way back to prehistoric, human beings, when they go out hunting, first of all, they don't have access to that much grains and carbs. And second of all, they will go out and hunt when they don't have food because they don't have storage, right? So they'll eat and then they'll be in a fasted state where they rely on ketones. And that's where they, when people have ketones, they will tell you that they feel sharper, they feel more connected, they are focused, their mental clarity is being enhanced. It's funny because one of my friend, I gave Ketone IQ to one of my friend to experiment, because he does this dance revolution like workout where you have a whole pad and you have to really like quickly step on those like light up panels. And the way he described it was really funny, because he was like, this is like a hack, like a cheat code, because he knew he screwed up the sequence, but for some reason his brain worked fast enough that he can still correct it, whereas normally he wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
So people, maybe, that's why we evolved to be able to produce ketones, so that when we are in this fasted state and we need to go out and hunt, we need that sharpness, we need that burst of energy, we need that sort of alertness that increases our chance of getting a prey. And this is what we saw in our $6 million contract with the Department of Defense, that when these military personnel, when operators are on ketones, even in hypoxia, where there is a drop in cognitive performance or drop in brain performance because of the low oxygen, with ketones, the drop actually gets mitigated, and they saw an improvement in reaction time and vigilance.
So fascinating. So you might argue that if we went back 11,000, 12,000 years, pre-agricultural revolution, dance revolution wasn't around at that juncture, but
Exactly.
but there was some other utility to ketones, on the Serengeti, just in terms of being able to react and deploy energy quickly. Would you argue or theorize, I suppose, that going back 11,000 years ago, the relationship or the proportion between ketones and, let's say, glucose in the bloodstream was a little bit more on even footing in comparison to what we're looking at today?
I think it's definitely very, very probable that our reliance on ketones then was way higher than it is now. It's also the constant access to foods that we keep snacking and we eat in between meals, and that doesn't do well for the anabolic and catabolic state, right? Because you're sending signal to your brain to like.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about that tenuous balance between anabolic and catabolic states, if you move upstream from that, it's really related to another yang-yin relationship, which is that of abundance and scarcity, right? So in scarcity, you're going to be more catabolic. With abundance, you're going to be more anabolic, and you're going to hopefully store fat for a rainy day.
I love that you brought in this concept, Jeff, because I think as I grow older, as I see more life experience, I've learned to appreciate and value the yin and yang. I appreciate the abundance as much as I appreciate the scarcity of things. I appreciate the happiness as much as I appreciate the sadness of life, because then it allows me to really see things in perspective and see life as is.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't know one without the other. This is the concept of the unity of opposites, right? I mean, metabolism requires a relationship, as you so eloquently laid out at the beginning of our conversation, between catabolic states and anabolic states. We wouldn't know happiness without sadness, or hot without experiencing cold. And so when we start to eliminate scarcity, it doesn't feel like abundance anymore, because it just feels like the default mode, and then we see the detrimental impacts of that. So when I have come to believe that healthy systems are all about balance, and we see that in nature everywhere that we look. I mean, you sit on the seashore, if you sit there long enough, you're going to see a high tide and a low tide, and everything that exists and arises as phenomenon within nature, is made of waves, hydraulic waves, or electricity is the repulsion and attraction of positive and negatively charged particles, or so everywhere you look, there are these relationships that maintain this kind of unsteady, unstable stability, and I think
always
nature,
in the flux.
Yeah, always in the flux, right? I thought it's a vibratory dance, as Einstein told us. So let me get into. I want to ask you one more question about ketones, because I've heard that ketones, when used in cellular respiration, also reduce the production of ROS, of reactive oxygen species and free radicals. Can you comment on that?
So this is a very interesting topic, because we know that when ketones are being elevated, either in ketogenic diet or via exogenous ketones, meaning external sources where you directly drink a ketone, it does have anti-inflammatory properties. So it reduces inflammation. So in a sense that you can say that it may reduce ROS production. Now, these may be in individuals with high ROS production or have a dysfunctional metabolism already. But in some healthy individuals, they saw an increase in uncoupling in mitochondria when they have ketones, right? And when you have uncoupling, you have an increased production of ROS. So which is true, right? It's like, does it increase it or does it reduce it? The way I see it, ketone definitely has an anti-inflammatory property, especially with regards to NLRP3, which is an inflammasome, which plays a huge role in neurodegenerative diseases and mental health. And that has shown to improve when people or animals have been put on ketogenic diet or inject direct BHB into the brain. And how I see ketone is more of an adaptive fuel, because I've seen many studies with opposing results here. So, for example, mTOR, right? In longevity study, they saw calorie restriction increasing in ketones lowers mTOR and it increases longevity. But then when you pair ketones with workout and proteins and carbs after workout as a post-exercise nutritional strategy, they saw a leucine-mediated mTOR activation that helps with recovery. So it does both at the same time, but it adapts to the environment and the stimulus that you provided. Another example is inflammatory, right? long term, like people with neurodegenerative diseases saw a decrease in inflammatory biomarkers. But then when they did a in vitro in a test tube, they put ketones in it and they put bacteria toxin. They saw an increase in inflammation in the cell culture when there is ketone present. But that's what we want. When there is an invasion in our body, we want our inflammatory biomarkers to flare up. We want our inflammation to come into play, because that gives signal to our immune system to fight off the invasion. But what we don't want is when our body reacts to a certain threat when there is no threat. We don't want inflammation to go up when we're just eating a lot of food, right? That doesn't sound right, does it? No. So we don't want to drive our body into overdrive at all times when we're just sitting down, literally doing nothing and eating. That's what we don't want. So I think there's a lot more research to be done on the ketone side of things, on mechanism of action, as well as the effect of ketones on respiration, on mitochondria, on antioxidant defense, and also damage. Just looking at, different protocols, it produces different results. It just creates this intrigue in me and a lot of scientists. It's like, what does this actually do, and what does it actually signal? Does it actually signal? And Buck Institute, Dr. Brianna Stubbs and John Newman, they are doing tremendous research around longevity and signaling of ketones. They're looking at beta hydroxybutyrylation, which is essentially BHB binding to the DNA and essentially creating signals that affects translation and transcription, and therefore affect the lower cascade of the pathways.
Fascinating. Yeah. I've heard a lot of theories. I mean, this is part of what makes life so exciting right now, is that we are on the frontier of so many emerging fields of study and theories, and it's hard to parse which asteroid is friendly and which one to shoot down. But I've heard about these uncoupling proteins that are triggered by ketones, for example, that sort of waste calories or waste energy, that provide sort of a trapdoor outside of the mitochondria that essentially don't overwhelm the production apparatus or the electron transport chain to sort of minimize, the production of ROS. So I've heard that theory. I've also heard, the ketones could be responsible for mitobiogenesis, essentially the creation of new mitochondria. Yeah. And that seems compelling. I don't know if you have anything to add there, but I also wanted to just touch briefly before we go on to exogenous ketones, because I have so many questions there.
Yeah. One thing I want to add, though, I'll let you finish first. Go ahead.
No, please, because I'm gonna have one more question before.
Okay, yeah. One thing I want to add as well, the uncoupling, like what we said earlier about the yin and yang, about the equilibrium, about homeostasis. Like what I said earlier as well, like mitochondria needs some form of bad signal, quote unquote, some form of ROS production in order for it to produce antioxidant defense. So these uncouplings, to a certain extent, is actually needed for an adaptation. So same thing when you work out, right? This is very relatable to a lot of people. When you work out, you're essentially breaking down your muscles, and you are, building new muscles. You need the recovery as much as you need the increase in stimulus, increase in progressive load, right? Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But where is the limit? I think the question is whether or not uncoupling is bad, whether or not ROS is bad. The question is how much ROS is good, and when we exceed that amount, that's bad. It's a matter of figuring out what that threshold is, and I am quite confident that the threshold is different from people to people, but also it's different from a healthy population versus a diseased population.
Yeah. So one of the areas of discussion that I found so fascinating in your conversation with Ben Bickman, was when you were talking about the relationship between Alzheimer's and dementia and energy sources. So one of the things that you guys were pointing to And often we hear about Alzheimer's being dubbed as type 3 diabetes, right? So there's some form of energy deficit that's going on. And I think Ben was able to actually study tissues, hippocampal tissues from people who had died who had Alzheimer's. And you could see the insulin resistance and some sort of kind of glucose metabolism irregularities. Essentially, the brain could not process glucose. There was also high insulin levels. So if the brain couldn't use glucose readily, well, yeah, it would be crying out for ketones, but couldn't get ketones really because ketones can't exist in the presence of high insulin. And so then there was this imperfect storm, I guess you might call it, that was seemed to play a significant role in Alzheimer's. It was just a really fascinating conversation. I wonder if you had any takeaways there.
Yeah, I think that is pretty much how you described it. When the brain can't use glucose, and earlier we talked about when you're in a state of being fasted or when you're in a state of ketogenic diet, where you have really low glucose and therefore you are using ketones. But that's because you are directing your body to produce ketones. But in these patients, they are not having a ketogenic diet, they are not fasting, and therefore they are not producing their own ketones, but yet the body and the brain are having insulin resistance to resist the signal from insulin to take up glucose. So the brain has only got lactate left to use. And if you're not even taking in glucose, you're not even producing that much lactate. So that's a problem there. And I think that's where, ketone can essentially answer the energy deficit gap that is being caused by the glucose metabolism deficiency there.
Yeah. And then I think this leads us, right into the conversation on exogenous ketones, because as we discussed, there is an endogenous mechanism, but there's a lot of hurdles in the way given our modern culture. Even stress can have this whole cascading effect of raising cortisol levels, which then raise glucose levels, which is going to raise insulin, et cetera. So all these different things are contributing to high insulin levels and the absence of ketones. But okay, now enter the possibility of exogenous ketones. So what are exogenous ketones?
So for the first time in human history, we're able to produce a situation where our bodies can have both glucose and ketones at the same time. So even if we have a high glucose meal, we upregulate our insulin, but via exogenous ketones, our bodies can still be in the state of ketosis, where we have a high enough level of ketones in order to get the benefit out of it. So what are exogenous ketones, right? Exogenous ketones are essentially ketones that you can consume directly, like how you would consume protein supplement, right? You consume whey protein and it gives you the building blocks that your body needs if it is in the form of convenience. But ketones in this case, it's very unique because otherwise we can't consume ketones. There is no food that directly increase ketone levels. I mean, you can argue that coconut oil, MCT does increase ketone levels, but it's not ketone on its own, like proteins. And since, I think a decade ago, there are a lot of exogenous ketones in the market now. And that's where the confusion starts. As people know, what you have one good thing, all these people are going to want to sell the same thing or something of a different derivative where they can patent it and monopolize it. So let me break it down, all the different exogenous ketones that are in the market right now. I think ketone salts have been in the market the longest, and I think people are most familiar with. And ketone salts are essentially BHB, so beta hydroxybutyrate, what we talked about as a ketone body, bound with a salt, either potassium, sodium, magnesium, all of that. Ketone salt can raise your blood ketone levels up to 0.7 to 1 millimolar, right? the problem with ketone salt is that you can't increase the dose to increase your blood BHB level, because once you increase the dose too much, you'll start to get GI issues, and you are increasing your salt load, and then you have to balance it with your diet and all of that. But it is the cheapest, one of the cheapest option of exogenous ketones up there. And then there is MCT we talked about, which is medium chain triglycerides, which is the most ketogenic, triglycerides, goes into your liver, gets converted to BHB, but that goes up to about 0.5 millimolar. So it doesn't go too high. And just for reference, if you are on a normal standard diet, standard Western diet, you're not on ketogenic diet, you're not fasting, your ketone levels should be 0 to 0.1 millimolar. And for therapeutic reasons, for a lot of research, they would say at least get above 1 millimolar. And for performance in endurance exercise and all of that, get above 2 millimolar. So that's between 1 to 2 is what we want, ideally, for metabolic health and to a certain extent performance. And then we have ketone esters. A lot of people, we HVMN brought the first ketone ester into the market in 2017. And we basically coined the term ketone esters. It's just a fancy name of two molecules being bound together in an ester bond, right? It's a ketone, BHB, bound with butanediol in an ester bond. But ever since then, people think that this is this magic molecule, right, that makes people go, into superhuman mode. Ever since, we brought the first ketone ester, the BHB bound with butanediol, into the market, now there have been a lot of other ketone esters. We've got 2C6 bound with butanediol. We've got acetoacetate bound with butanediol. We've got, what else? We've got, so essentially anything ketone that is bound with butanediol in an ester bond is called a ketone ester now. You got ketone diester, you got ketone monoester, and all of that. And it does work. It increases your blood BHB up till 3 to 5 millimolar. And it's dose dependent. So the more you drink, the higher your blood BHB will be. And at that point in 2017, we thought, it's a good thing, right? Because, ketone is so good for you. So higher, the better, no? Then a lot of studies came out. First of all, people started to feel sick when they have too much. When their blood BHB levels reach 5, 6, 7, they just start to not feel well. And that's how you will feel if you overdose on glucose. Any substrates, your body will start rejecting it because you're just having too much, too quickly. And one study came out showing an increase in cardiorespiratory stress biomarkers, because the huge spike in blood BHB also lowers blood pH, meaning it increases blood acidity. And when you're working out, you're producing lactic acid, you're increasing blood BHB, you're lowering your blood pH and increasing acidity. Your body is trying to excrete as much carbon dioxide as possible in order to balance that. So these athletes saw an increase in heart rate, increase in breathing rate, all these biomarkers that basically shows that they're working out harder without the improvement in performance. They didn't see any improvement in performance. So why would you want to drink something that makes you work harder, but you actually not work harder objectively, but you feel like you're working harder? And these people also have higher rate of perceived exertion. So that means that they found that exercise to be harder than they would otherwise. So then that brings us to Ketone IQ, which is what HVMN sells. We launched this in 2021, and it was basically due to the fact that ketone ester was, one, too expensive. It was 25 grams for about $40. Two, it tastes very bad. It tastes very bitter. And I'm not saying that Ketone IQ tastes like soda. It doesn't. But it tastes way better. In fact, one of our tasks with the $6 million contract with the DoD was to improve the flavor of ketone ester. And we worked with Monell, which is a expert, sensory research center, and they know everything about the taste and improving taste and masking taste, and they couldn't do anything about it. And I presented with results in the Metabolic Health Summit. They essentially tried artificial sweetener, natural sweeteners, dairy, all of it. The sweetness actually got masked by the ketone ester bitterness. That's how bad it was. And then the third point is the pharmacokinetics, the biology of ketone ester. As I said, it lowers your blood pH, it increases blood acidity so much that you may not get the improvement in performance. And besides, as I said, for therapeutic users, you don't need all the way high. You don't need that high of a blood BHB, between 3 to 5. Anything above 1, they already saw an improvement, especially if you have to drink it daily, multiple times a day. People just can't stomach that. And because of the taste, they get a lot of GI issues because they start puking and it just doesn't taste pleasant, especially if you go into an intensive exercise afterwards. Because a lot of these studies are being done for performance or exercise performance and athletes having to drink them. Ketone IQ is essentially butanediol. So as I said earlier, all these ketone esters are bound with butanediol. So that is the common denominator. And butanediol is essentially a molecule that is found naturally as well in avocado, peppers, coconut, and all of that in a small amount. Butanediol enters your liver, gets converted into BHB, and that releases slowly into your body. And because your liver is the gatekeeper here, your liver gets signal from the rest of your body saying, how fast you want to release this BHB, which works as a great ceiling, because when we did our internal study, we did not see anything higher than 2.5 millimolar, even with a very high dose. So we know the safety of the molecule, and also it doesn't spike your blood acidity.
So the liver serves as almost a regulator to
Almost
keep
a regulator.
serum levels in that Goldilocks zone.
Correct. And
Yeah.
that's the very interesting thing as well, because I think we did this as we launched it, me and the two co-founders of HVMN, Michael Brand and Jeff Wu. We did a podcast together, and we recorded on camera. We drink different doses. So I think one of us drank 1 dose, 2 doses, 3 doses, and all of us had 3 different baseline, because I think Jeff was on a very high ketone level already because he was already fasting. But surprisingly, he had, even though the highest dose, it capped at 2.5. And so, it's the increase of blood BHB when you're already high on blood BHB, it doesn't increase that much. It will definitely cap around 2 to 2.5. If you're lower, if you're like 0.1, it will put you up to like 1.5 or more. So that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, and then as it pertains specifically for high performance, would there be a scenario where you want to combine, for example, available glucose, since it's so readily taken up by muscles, with endogenous ketones?
So of all the studies that are in performance, they always put glucose in. So it's never meant to replace your existing workout strategy. So if you're already taking 60, 70 grams per hour of glucose while you're working out or while you're running or while you're in a race, it's meant to augment that. So when you take ketones, what they have seen is that they saw a glycogen sparing effect, where you are sparing your glycogen, you're burning, the ketones and tap into your fat storage perhaps, and then enable you to run further and longer. So that's where ketones really shine when used in conjunction with glucose when it comes to pre-workout, sort of acute setting. In a recovery setting, studies have shown, when I talked about the leucine-mediated mTOR activation for recovery after exercise, these athletes were given carbs, proteins, and ketones. Same thing with another study on overreaching symptom, cyclists going through Tour de France training, and they were given ketones with carbs and protein as a standard post-recovery nutritional strategy, half an hour after exercise and half an hour before bed. 3 weeks later, they saw an increase in performance in power output of about 15%.
And so I have a little bottle of the Ketone IQ here
Yeah.
for those of us who have the watching this on video. Is this denomination the recommended dosage? I mean,
That,
as you said, the liver has its own regulatory capabilities, so it'll release it into the bloodstream as it sees fit. But is this more or less the one per day, or can you get
that
into dosage a tiny bit?
Yeah, that's sure. So one of that small shot is 10 grams of butanediol, and that's our recommended dose. And we don't recommend more than 3 doses per day for a normal person. If you're just using it for metabolic health, 3 per day is more than enough. Some athletes, they use more because a lot of these studies are using weight match doses. So they use 0.3 to 0.5 grams per kilograms. So that translates to roughly 2 to 3 doses if you're like, 60 to 70 kilogram person, because they're using it for exercise. And the nice thing about ketone is that because your body does use it quite quickly, when you're using it to work out, especially if they measure their blood ketone levels after 1 hour, 2 hours, you can see the curve going up and then going back down really quickly because your body is using up. So that's why they're not afraid of taking more than 3 doses per day. But what we do recommend our customers for the general health population is 3 per day, and one of that is 1 dose or 10 grams. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so you were mentioning that the ketone esters, which had the BHB and butanediol sort of bond, if you will, one of the side effects there was some nausea in some cases. Do you see any side effect with just the butanediol?
No, we actually just completed a study at the University of North Georgia, one of the leading military colleges in the United States. We looked at anaerobic exercise, and this is the first time ever anyone has looked at anaerobic exercise and ketones, because we think about ketones, we think about fats. When we think about fats, we think about endurance, because that's when we talked about earlier, you want to tap into that big storage of energy versus glucose. And whenever we talk about anaerobic exercise, which is high intensity exercise, glucose is always king. And I still believe that. But in this study, when they were given glucose and ketones, somehow they're able to increase power output, peak power output, average power output, velocity, and decrease fatigue. We just submitted this to the Frontiers in Physiology journal. It's under review right now. And it's super interesting because, yes, you're still using the glucose for the burst of energy, but for some reason, ketones have certain effect that enables these participants to output more power and feel less fatigued. As to whether it's purely metabolic in terms of substrate utilization, or there is some analgesic effect on the brain that makes them feel less painful, we don't know yet, but this is what science is about, right? You find one thing out and then you follow up with another research. And if any researchers out there see our paper when we publish it in a couple of weeks, then hopefully they embark on their journey on proving, one, if this is replicable, and two, if it is, what is the exact mechanism that is affecting either the muscles or the brain?
Yes. Science always builds on the shoulder of prior science, right?
Absolutely.
Are there any contraindicators that people should be aware of?
One thing I would add, though, whenever you take Ketone IQ, after an hour, you will see a drop in blood glucose. So, in fact, there's a couple of studies in Canada, University of British Columbia. Dr. Jonathan Little, he used Ketone IQ to show the decrease in blood glucose after eating, which is really good for people with obesity or diabetes, to show the drop in blood glucose. So if you are prone to hypoglycemia, then I would keep a continuous glucose monitor handy, or make sure you monitor your own blood glucose after an hour or 2 hours. And if you're feeling cold and shivery and that's like the low glucose feeling, have a little bit of sugar just to keep yourself safe. But generally it doesn't drop to a point where it's unsafe. where people need to go to the hospital or people like passing out. It doesn't get to that point because as we talked about earlier, your liver is the regulator and it's pretty good at keeping your body alive. So it's never dangerous enough. And even then, it's like maybe 1 in 10 people who experience that, who are like really, really high metabolism and always on ketogenic diet and always very keto adapted and very low glucose at all times. So you need all of those factors. And then you have a high dose of ketone IQ, then you probably experience that. But in fact, apart from that, I don't think there are any other side effects within the recommended dose, for sure.
Yeah, and will exogenous ketones? Well, it won't really impact the oxidation of fat, of adipose tissue, really, because it's not necessarily triggering that whole process of lipolysis and triglyceride breakdown. But would there be any sense in someone who is already on a ketogenic diet or is an intermittent faster to then supplement additionally with exogenous ketones? Like, what's the relationship there?
That's a great question. So a lot of people asked, if they are not on ketogenic diet, can they take it? And the answer is yes, obviously. That's basically allowing you to experience the benefit without having to do the diet. But then the other side asks, if I'm on ketogenic diet, if I am already burning fat, why would I take this? Because temporarily it may stop lipolysis because it's telling my body that I already have ketones, so I'm not breaking down my own fats for ketones. That's true. If you are already on ketogenic diet and you are on a good path and you are achieving your goals, then there is no need for this. However, there are people who are on cyclical ketogenic diet. They go in and out of ketogenic diet. They want to be in ketosis and allow their body to really get back into the ketotic state. Then they use this as an intermittent. But there are also people who have been on ketogenic diet and struggle to raise their blood BHB level or blood ketone levels. Then they also augment it with ketone IQ to help them get into that Goldilocks zone. And in terms of study, very interestingly enough, when given exogenous ketones, our body upregulates the enzymes that's needed for keto metabolism. So it upregulates the enzyme to convert butanediol to beta hydroxybutyrate. It enhances the enzyme that changes beta hydroxybutyrate into acetoacetate, into acetyl-CoA, and then goes into the Krebs cycle, creates energy. So that's just biochemistry. So why does that matter? If you think about it, you're only having one dose of that. It has 70 calories. 70 calories you can burn out after a podcast. Like if you're walking for, feel 10, 15 minutes, you might burn those off already, right? So it's a very small amount when it comes to calorie. But the fact that it upregulates these enzymes is actually preparing your body to be more keto adapted afterwards. So if you're already on ketogenic diet and you feel like you're not that keto adapted yet, this could be a really good way to upregulate these enzymes so that when you finish burning the exogenous ketones, your body switches gear to your endogenous ketones, and now you have all the mechanism and machinery ready to be able to use up your own ketones for better efficiency.
So good. I have one more question. It's actually just kind of playing out in my brain as I think about it, because I'm trying to kind of unravel the mechanisms here around performance. So I'm an avid tennis player, for example, and I'll go out and play someone half my age, which is probably foolish. So I'll need some therapy around that. But in the 90-degree heat, and halfway through, I'll start breathing. I'm breathing very hard because my essentially cells want more and more oxygen for the second and third phases of cellular respiration. And, then the next day, if I get, whipped by a young, 28-year-old Division I player or something, I might wake up a little bit sore because of that O2 oxygen debt. My body went into glycolysis more for energy. The first phase, the anaerobic phase of cellular respiration, and there's a byproduct of that is lactic acid, which can make your muscles feel sore the next day. I assume that if I was supplementing with some exogenous ketones as I was in that process, I might spare myself of some of that lactic acid next day soreness. Would that be fair to say?
That's an interesting theory. But also, I think I've interviewed some scientists who said lactic acid causing the soreness is not a thing. Apparently,
okay.
That's the interesting part. They're like, it's just purely driven by the muscle breakdown rather than the lactate accumulation, because lactate will very quickly be converted back once oxygen is available. So when you stop playing and you're already breathing normally and you're at rest, lactate gets converted back into whatever that it needs to convert, either pyruvate or whatever, and goes into the respiration. So I don't know how far the truth is, because I haven't looked into it since I've heard about that. But I think certainly in terms of recovery, we have anecdotal cases where people take it before and after their workout, and the next day they feel more refreshed, or they feel more ready in terms of the state of their body being able to do another set of workouts.
Well, maybe soon we'll see Novak Djokovic and Carlos Alcaraz pounding some exogenous ketones, some ketone IQ before their matches.
We're talking to a lot of athletes, and like famous marathoner Sarah Hall, she's being fueled by ketone IQ. This week, actually, one of the most famous marathoner, Don, in Arizona, Michael Brand is helping him pace. Michael Brand is our CEO, helping him pace for the race as well. So we have a lot of athletes who are now believing in us, because not only that we share the science and having scientific integrity and transparency, but we also let them try it. And most of the time, like our VP of Growth, Michael Lee, the way he works with these partners is really, really great. I think I really respect the way he says. He's like, I'm not going to give you a script. If you want to do content, you do whatever you want and whatever you feel. And first and foremost, before we even become partners, like, you try this product. If you like it, we can move forward. If you don't like it, like, there's no foul, you can have the products, because we do believe the subjective feel, it's very powerful, and the experience is very powerful. Because nowadays, as I said, there's so many competitors, there's so many exogenous ketones out there that it becomes confusing for consumers. It becomes confusing for athletes even. But most athletes already know what is what, because that has been in the athlete market for a while. And some competitors was like, HVMN is lying, or like ketone dial doesn't work, or ketone IQ doesn't work. Ketone IQ is an alcohol. And then at the same time, they are selling ketone ester, which half of which is also butanediol, but then theirs is not alcohol. I'm like, the hypocrisy and the lack of integrity is so apparent.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate your commitment to the rigorous science, and I also find the blog on the website to be incredibly informative. And if anyone is seeking just some education in metabolism and ketosis 101, they can really get a lot of very thorough but also accessible information there. So yeah, this is just a fascinating conversation, Latt. Can you remind our viewers where they can find you and keep abreast of your work, and if they're interested in the product, where they might be able to find it?
Sure. They can find the product in Sprouts nationwide, actually. If you go to Sprouts, the first shot is also on us. So if you buy the first shot, you scan the QR code, we'll give you a refund back. You can find us on Amazon. You can find us also on hvmn.com. You can buy it directly from us. If you want to find me, I'm at Latt Mansor, LattMansor, on all social media. Also, I am the host of the HVMN podcast that we talked about today. Go check it out. And I believe you have a code as well that you can share for your audience to get the discount. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I highly encourage you to keep up the work on the podcast. It's really just fantastic, and it really provides an opportunity for people to go into some significant depth if they're curious about these topics. You curate your guests really wonderfully, and you conduct your interviews with a lot of curiosity and a lot of stringency. So well done, and I hope we can have another conversation maybe next time in person.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. And, people like you, Jeff, who paved the way and inspire me to be a better host and better podcaster. So I want to thank you and your audience as well. And I would love to have you if, you have time to be on HVMN podcast where we can talk about more spirituality and practices. And I just love your calmness and your energy and how you're just present. And I think a lot of us can learn to be that, especially, coming from Asia. I've studied in Europe, and in America, what I realize is that things are very hectic. Everyone is out there chasing our dreams, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's also the forgetfulness of being present and being with ourselves. Like yesterday, work has always, it's fast paced, it's tough, it's stressful. And yesterday I was working out at the gym, and my friend just asked me one question, and he was like, "How are you?" I was like, "Well, it's okay, as good as a Monday can go, right?" And he asked me one question. He was like, "But did you take time for yourself though?" And that was so meaningful for me at that point, because I'm like, that's a good reminder. So thank you. He was like, "No, I'm also reminding myself that." He was like, because we are so good at telling people what they should do when sometimes we don't follow what we preach.
Yeah. Well, they say wisdom is taking your own advice. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm admittedly a work in progress, but if I have any advice to share with anyone, in this time where we're just living, in this persuasion economy or the attention economy, however you want to frame it, and every single brand and human and friend and family member is vying for our attention at every possible moment, and there's so many different ways at us, and pings and dings and Slack and email and text and billboards and other forms of advertising that are, algorithmically contrived, that it's so simple just to go through life being incessantly distracted and never here. And I think, this podcast, if anything, has trained me to be present. And, the most precious gift I think that we can give each other kind of in this moment is our conscious attention, to really provide someone else with your undivided focus. And that comes back, to benefit you, as you say. But I just think that presence of presence might be just the kindest and most compassionate thing that we could do right now. So maybe we'll end with that. Yeah. I'm very grateful, for you and your attention.
Same here.
Cool.
And time flew.
Right. Yes, it did. All right. Well, to be continued. And I'll see you in Topanga or up in your neck of the woods in San Francisco.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.